Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast, a community of amazing people who love talking about and sharing their love of the details behind making games, whether or not they're actually based in London. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns, and I'm on a quest to understand everything you wanted to know about game dev, but never dared to ask. And today I am delighted to be joined by Harún. Harún, how are you doing? Nice to see you. I'm just going to transition across. There we go. Hey, Harún. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hi, Oscar. Thank you so much for having me. This is my first podcast that I'm on. So my name is Harún Ali. My pronouns are he, him. I am the embedded environment art tester at Cloud Imperium Games. I've been in the industry for probably over 4 years now at this point, primarily working in QA. So before Cloud, I was a game dev teacher. Before that, I worked at TT Games only for like 6 months, and I worked on a game called Lego Dimensions.
And you mentioned that Lego Dimensions we were talking earlier, and it's an interesting kind of concept, isn't it? Where we've got an interactive experience aimed at kids that's using a physical set of devices, so you can bring them to life on a screen.
It was a very interesting genre at the time, because I think it was like the mid 2010s, where like there was like so many different franchises out there and companies that were making them. Like you said, Skylanders, you had Disney Infinity, Lego Dimensions kind of jumped in there as well. Nintendo kind of did it with the Amiibo stuff, and I think like we were saying earlier, like with the Lego one that I liked particular was that it was actual Lego pieces. Like you had like an actual like proper Lego figurine, whereas like the other ones there's just like a statue. Like you can't like move it around or anything. That's like, as a toy, it's kind of like, oh, it's just kind of like a statue. It's not like, oh, I can make Marty just do like a 360 backflip or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one of the things I think is really interesting is that with Lego, at least you could do something with it. I mean, I think one of those, I saw a few things. There was a bunch of teams trying to do all sorts of things with AR at the time as well. But that was maybe a little bit later, but it was so early in the journey for AR. Yeah. And it's interesting how all of those are basically gone. I mean, Amiibos are still around, but that's kind of about it. They're more of a collectible asset, like an add-on, aren't they, nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, like it is a shame, because like Lego Dimensions, like you look at it on paper and you see all these amazing franchises that the game had. Like I worked in the first wave of Lego Dimensions. So you had like Ghostbusters, you had Doctor Who, you had Scooby Doo, you had, I'm trying to think of some other ones. Back to the Future was one of them as well. So you had all these kind of awesome franchises clashing together, but it just didn't kind of take off as well as like the other Lego games. I think probably the market was probably saturated at that point, and people were kind of like, we're kind of over with that. It's like the same thing we were saying with like AR. I remember like it was like the PlayStation AR book thing.
Yeah,
because I remember like one of the designers and Wonderbook, that was it. I remember like one of the designers came to the Yorkshire Games Festival, although I think it was Bradford Animation Festival at the time, when that game was like just recently announced. It was talking about like how to create that and stuff. And I think VR, not VR, AR was like very much in its early days, whereas now it's kind of backish thanks to like Pokemon Go. I think like even with like the HoloLens a little bit, but yeah, it's not like as popular.
We're
as,
not
like,
there
say,
yet in the AR world, are we? I actually knew a few people who were doing some stuff with their Wonderbook, because I was working at London Studio when they kicked off Wonderbook, and also iToy, the thing that they did before that. And there's all sorts of fun and games around dealing with the camera that they had at the time with the PS3 and the resolution they could get with that or not. But let's talk about the topic we're here to talk about. So the wonders of QA, and I think kind of really interesting a little bit. You talk about QA as your role now. Did you always want to do QA? Was that your burning ambition, or did you look at QA as a kind of stepping stone to some other kind of process?
Originally, I saw it as like a stepping stone. I think a lot of people, because I did like when I studied games like academic wise, like so like at FE college and at like a HE level. So I studied like games art. So I wanted to become like a 3D modeler, like an artist. And so I knew my art skills weren't quite there yet. So when I was like a teacher, or when I was doing like say my 6 months at TT, like I was trying to develop my art skills a little bit more. And when I was a teacher, like I could actually spend a bit more time developing my skills, because like, oh, I'm teaching game dev stuff, so it's like I can improve my art skills, not just for my own betterment, but for helping my students out as well. But I was kind of like, I want to just get back into the industry now. I was too much of like an outsider looking in. And one of the roles that I wanted to go for originally was a producer role, because I thought, oh, my knowledge and experience as a teacher would probably work well as a producer. But I didn't really have enough experience in the industry at the time to be able to get into a producer role. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll go into it as a QA. And I remember enjoying my time as QA for TT. And I thought, okay, this would be interesting, get back into QA and then probably work my way into a role that I want to do, which I think everyone kind of does. But when
It's
I
so
started,
common, isn't it? It is the thing
yeah.
that a lot of people did get into the games industry through that route. I mean, it's not the only route, but it is a very common one.
Oh yeah, I think the reason being with that as well is like there's a lack of junior roles, apprenticeships, or even like graduate schemes. I think it's definitely getting
Yeah.
better these last few years now. Like, I know, because I know people who work at like say Inter Games,
Hmm.
they're really kind of like pushing for more graduate schemes. You know, companies being more active with those sort of things, and even junior roles and stuff like that. I think like it's one of the things with game dev. It's just this constant machine that's always just turning and turning, and it just refuses sometimes just to slow down to bring someone in to elevate them and to teach them
Well,
and
it's also
into a
that we
role.
have relatively small companies, and the trouble is that in order to have a kind of good leveling up program inside an organization like a game team, you have to have a pretty good big game team. Because if you don't have juniors, seniors, leads, management as a pipeline, if there's only like one person doing design, how can you have a pipeline to teach them the skills to be the intermediate or senior participant? Now, I'm not saying that's an excuse. I'm just trying to provide some context. And I think we have a serious problem about helping people get into the job, because if we don't have the skills, how can we train you up to be able to do them? And B, once you're in, how we get you to the stage where you can progress, because doing management isn't the same thing as doing the job.
Yeah,
Getting better at
absolutely
the
true.
job isn't the same thing as managing people, which is a completely different skill, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, like I remember I was just chatting to like a friend of mine recently who was saying that
Mm.
like when other people kind of do like talks or going or become teachers to teach like sort of game dev or game art or whatever it may be, like they may be amazing at their craft, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're good at teaching that to other people, because those like interpersonal skills that you really need to kind of develop. You have to have lot of patience as well when it comes to kind of like training someone up, understanding like what's the best ways to teach them, what works, what doesn't work. And it's a very unique skill to have. Like it was definitely something that I learned as well. Like when I got into teaching, I was literally kind of thrown into the deep end. Like I just kind of
Mm.
did what I thought was right. But then when I started learning, doing my postgraduate, I was like, oh, there are different learning methods and techniques that you can do to train someone up. And it's understanding, because it's a very personal sort of thing when you're training someone up. You have to kind of understand what works with one person, what might not work with another person, and just finding a way to kind of encourage, elevate, and engage them.
Completely agree, and I think that's the thing, is understanding the right techniques, the right responses, what the motivations are for people. So bringing us back to the kind of QA function. I mean, so um, QA is one of those odd roles where when you recruit someone into that space, particularly as a junior, you're not necessarily assuming that they're going to make a long-term career of it. But I think there is a long-term career in QA. I think there are people who respect that kind of development process, the ability to be able to, not just like do the test of a game. It's not just playing a game. It's understanding the specializations within that and being able to understand how you plan that, how you incorporate that into particularly when you start talking about these longer-term lifestyle living experiences, where there's a pipeline of material that's got to be done on a repeatable, efficient basis. So one of those specializations clearly is art. I think you're specifically looking at kind of, is it environment art you look at
Yeah,
specifically, or is it?
it's yeah. My role is like environment art, although it's kind of evolved a little bit. So it's like locations. So I do kind of implement like understanding like the design side of it as well. But like it started off initially as kind of focused more on on the art side of things.
But again, let's put it into context. Obviously, the game that you're working on, and we're not going to go into the controversies and the questions and the time frames and releases and all that kind of stuff. We're just interested in kind of the role. In the role that you've got, you're dealing with some really complicated environments, aren't you?
Yeah, I think Star Citizen is an extremely ambitious game. It is like huge in terms of its scale, and even the quality of its art as well is just absolutely amazing. Like I'm always stunned by like what the teams come up with. So it is a challenging role, but in a good way, because obviously there's new kind of things that are always coming in, and like new updates to like how like with the pipeline and stuff like that, in order to actually like it gives you new challenges when it comes to testing, because like as you said earlier, like with testing, it's a very repetitive thing. So like, you know, no matter how much you're a fan of like a certain genre or a certain game or a company, if you're playing their games 8 hours a day, 360 like 365 days a year or whatever it's going to be, like eventually you're going to be like, oh my god, I just want to do something a bit different. And I think that's a great thing about like with Star Citizen, because obviously it's like a live service sort of
You're
game.
not going to worry about doing something different.
Like with Star Citizen, because obviously they're constantly updating it, making, you know, new locations, new content. There's always a fun challenge or like a new obstacle to kind of overcome.
So, I mean, let's think about that. So let's think, I mean, one of the things I want to try and explore is kind of the practicalities of QA. And actually, I think what we'll do is let's start from thinking about what kind of QA is there. So for me, when I'm looking at it as a product owner, I'm looking at it kind of like, I want to have a unit test. So every piece of function, every drop, I want to know that it's self-contained enough to be able to test in itself. I want to have end-to-end testing, where I've got network, or at least lots of modules of code hooking together. I want to know that there's some smoke tests being done to make sure that you're getting the right outputs, inputs throughout the process. But when we're talking about art, there's a whole different scale of things to consider, whether you're talking about character assets or you're talking about items in world. You know, so I'm thinking about, you know, an outfit of a character in a particular scene, you know, how that reacts to the environment. So, you know, lighting, for example, reflections. What sort of things are you thinking about when you're looking at your role in particular? You know, what are the kind of criteria that drive the decision making about how you test?
So the first thing that I kind of look out for when I'm testing out like a location is, first off, is it solid? So making sure like collision detection is there. So just make like, it's a lot of kind of like walking around, running into walls, making sure like everything is actually solid so players don't kind of fall through the game worlds.
My favorite thing, falling through the world. I remember one of the joys of No Man's Sky was when I mined too deep in the early days and ended up falling through the world.
It's always fun. Like even now, like I think like I was playing like Assassin's Creed Origins, and I somehow accidentally like fell through the world and looking up and just seeing it sort of slowly disappear because my character wouldn't die.
I was playing Odyssey over Christmas, and I didn't fall through the world, but I had a number of occasions where there was a ridge with nothing. There was just like the edge of the ridge occasionally. It's like, you know that they put so many hours into testing that, and yet it's still there.
Yeah, even with collision detection, even if it is there, there's always ways for people to kind of cheese it, like try to find workarounds to kind of phase through it. I mean, that's one of the things, like as a QA tester, you kind of think, okay, what can I do to break the collision? Because like if it's in like, say you make a model in like say 3ds Max and you've put like, the collision detection in there, you've exported it into the game engine, like that collision is not going to break unless you broke it in 3ds Max. Yes. So you have to make so so if it's in game and you find a way to kind of phase through it, it's like, okay, how did I do that? Maybe it's the physics. Maybe if I'm pushing something like repeatedly against it, maybe the force of it just makes it kind of go through. Maybe there's a certain animation that you play that, because that animation doesn't have any collision on it, it can help you kind of cheat and kind of force your way through it.
I love that you say that, because you take me right back to my PlayStation Home days when we were working PlayStation Home. We hadn't got any content, so it became content for players to try and. It's right at the beginning. I mean, we're talking about. I'm exaggerating by saying we didn't have any. We did. We had things like Rebel Air Race. We had to play pool, all that kind of stuff. But no. The fun people had was rubbing up against the collision layers, doing some movement so that they could find themselves popping up in the middle of nowhere. And that was just hilarious that people just found that fun. So, you know, it is amazing how sometimes these bugs that annoy the heck out of us are actually quite fun to find if you're a player.
Oh yeah, especially if you're a speedrunner, you can use them to just complete levels like really quick.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, we talked a bit about kind of like these kind of modes and ways of looking at the testing. So, you know, let's go a little bit more on that. So, one of the things that I think is interesting is how things change in different environments. So, you know, if you have a spaceship, if you have a character and the lighting is slightly off or the reflections in the environment are slightly off, they can make things look quite weird. How do you kind of like deal with that? I mean, are you dealing with it, right? Say, how do these objects look like in this space? Are there reference objects that you're using to do that? Are there tools? How are you checking what lighting looks like? How effective? I mean, how it's affecting frame rate? That kind of stuff. What sort of things do you do to plan how you're going to solve those kind of problems?
Yeah. So using lighting as an example, I think like having like a basic understanding of like lighting theory kind of helps a little bit. So like we said, like with reflections, refractions, you know, like if you're walking into a room and it's semi-lit, but like there's like a corner like just completely black, it's like that doesn't look right. And you have to kind of
Yeah.
you need to kind of like delve into, okay, what might the issues be with that. So it could be like, you know, like if anyone's used like Unreal Engine 4 or 5, like you have like environment probes which kind of like do like real time kind of like reflections and that kind of stuff. So it's like maybe there's issue with that, maybe it needs rebaking or something, or maybe like a setting's probably broken on it or something. So you might have to provide like information to the lighting artists or developers. So usually like with QA, we have access to a bunch of console variables, so like CVARs, so we can input like certain like things that will provide debug information on the screen or even in the game itself, like maybe like little helpers and stuff like that, to be like, okay, this particular thing that's not on or it's missing that needs to be there.
Although most people will know what you mean by, you know, debug or console. Do you want to just explain a little bit how that works? Because I know if you're new to the sort of the scene, you might not know about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Trying my very best to explain it, because even sometimes I'm kind of like, how do I explain it? It's one of those things where it's like, you know what it is, but how do you explain it?
That's what I'm getting used to it.
So like debugging is essentially like information. This is hard. This is a legitimately hard question.
Let me have a go at it then. So the way I like to look at it is there's normally some kind of interaction. So if you're doing a mobile device, you may say tap 5 times on the top left. Or you might have a series of keystrokes, you know, Control Alt 5 or whatever it might be. There'd be some mechanism that is not publicly shared. A lot of cheat codes are derived from these things that activates some behavior. So sometimes it might be an overlay that tells you here's a bunch of stats about what's going on in the scene. Sometimes it would be a mechanism that allows you to jump to a specific point in a specific level, in a specific flow of the story, or whatever it might be that something's happening. So they're basically ways of tracking you to shortcuts and providing you with information that's under the bonnet that ordinary players shouldn't see. Is that a fair way to put it?
I couldn't put it any better. You had the hit nail right. Thank you. Let's just like take that audio. Let's just overdub it on me to make myself sound smarter.
Yeah, then you feel great. Hey, look, I'm old. I've been doing this a long time. But the point is, though, it's like it's the programmers put tools into place to make it easier for the testers to know what's going on.
Yeah.
But you're using so do you work from a script? Do you work ad hoc? I mean, I'm a big believer in the Mythbusters comment that the only difference between science and screwing around is writing things down. So, you know, presumably you're writing this stuff down. What form does that take?
When it comes to writing things down, like a lot of times, like we're using like Jira. So,
Yeah.
or like I know other companies use stuff like Handsoft, Bugzilla. Like that's like a database where people can write up reports that can be put into like a big database for developers, publishers, or
So
whoever
you're
it needs to
basically
grab it.
creating what we call tickets, aren't you? You're
Yeah.
creating a ticket, presumably, or is it technically a ticket, or is it a bug report, or like a Trello card type style thing? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's more like Jira stuff. I mean, I don't think we use the term ticket, because like we have like different tags. So like one Jira report could be tagged as like a task. It could be tagged as like
Yeah.
a bug. It just depends on like the scenario, essentially.
Gotcha. Yeah. And in that, presumably, because again, the reason why I use ticket is because that was a term I've used before, but also bug report isn't a similar one. They often have like formats or specific piece of information. What sort of information are you collating?
It all depends on the bug. So, depending on the situation. So, say if like an art bug, for instance, if there is an issue with like say the LODs, which is level of detail, that just to I'll briefly explain that. Basically, being like depending on the distance that you're looking at an object, it will change its geometry. So, if you're looking at like say, like a book, for instance. I'm just seeing the books on your screen. So it's like, oh yeah, from like close up, like they're gonna have like really high detailed textures and like the geometry's gonna be like quite detailed. But like the further away you move away from it, you know, it gets like lower res textures, or like the geometry is like really basic. It helps with performance. So if a bug like that, for instance, if I find it in a level, I'd have to obviously give like detailed steps as to where it is,
So
and
it's
then
like
I provide
reproduction steps that
yeah.
help the programmer understand how you ended up with that experience.
Yeah, and the way that you should write like repro steps is you have to basically assume that nobody knows how to play the game. Like you don't even like too over detail. Like this is how to start the game. It's like no, they'll have like that base understanding. It's like you have to give enough understanding to be like, okay, this is the general area that it's in, and this is what you have to do to kind of to reproduce it. The extra information you might want to give is like you might want to give the name of the asset. So you might have like CVATs that display that information on screen. It might even give you the information for like say the level of detail, like what number it is. So like LOD 0, for instance, is like the high end art, like the nice looking one. But then like if it switches to like 1, that's okay, so it's slightly less detail sort of thing. So it's like okay, when it switches to 1, then it kind of breaks. Maybe like the pivot is offset, so the thing like say if it's a chair, it might have moved like 2 meters across. Like hang on, it shouldn't have moved at all. It should have stayed directly there. So giving like say the information of what the chair asset name is, so they can actually find that original file. So that's in like Maya or FreeBSD Max, and they can go in and make those changes in there.
And this is the kind of key thing, isn't it? It's like we've got to give the coder as much information as possible, or the artist as much information as possible, so they can find the specific thing, so they can focus their time and effort not on trying to find it and reproduce it, but on fixing it.
Yeah, because I think people forget. I think people forget that like artists, programmers don't play the game as much as a QA, because a QA tester will know like the game like the back of their hand. I mean, a designer will probably have played the game a little because obviously they're making the missions and the layouts and that kind of stuff, but they might not know the intricacies of it. So it's like you're kind of giving them that you kind of being like their eyes and ears on the ground essentially.
Yeah, and kind of. I mean, I don't know how. Do you use video to show the reproduction steps sometimes?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I always provide videos and screenshots. Like I try to give as much information as possible. And when I do like videos, I always try to give context, because if you've played Star Citizen, it's huge. So if you say, "Oh, this counter has like the incorrect texture on it," if you don't say where exactly it is or show exactly where it is, it's like there's like hundreds of counters in this place. Where am I gonna find it? So like what I like to do is, I show the counter, like say, okay, this is the close up of it, and then I might have like another video in that same video. I'll pull the camera back and be like, okay, it's in this building, it's through here. So giving them as much information as possible, because I have seen it where like on like say Reddit, for instance, where if players find bugs, they'll just have like a screenshot or a video of just when the issue happened, but not giving enough context. It's almost like game design theory, level design theory. It's like you need to kind of have like a point of reference to be able to know where exactly that bug is.
No, exactly. And being able to save the kind of time to get to that. I mean, I say that because I'm the worst at writing bug reports. I mean, particularly most times I find when it gets to me, the times you find bugs, they're these intermittent things that you can't replicate. Now, I know there's a problem, and I can tell you roughly where it happened, but it may not happen unless the circumstances of all the other things that I may have done that I don't remember I did happened. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, and that's the most important thing for like when being QA is like you have to be like hyper aware. You need to kind of
Yeah.
try to remember your steps, even if you forget some of them. Like you gotta like take that metaphorical step back and say, okay, what did I just do? Maybe it's worth like writing it down on paper or on like a sticky note or like a Word document and stuff. But then even when you find that book, that's when like the actual investigation part of it happens, because maybe you try to reproduce it and it doesn't happen. Then you've got to start thinking about all these different variables and just experiment with it. Sometimes it might just be like a one-off issue. It could just be like a spontaneous thing that happened. Like, oh, okay, I guess I've tried like 5-6 times and I can say definitively that it's not happened. I mean, if the issue is really, really bad, then you might have to get multiple tests to try. I think there was a great tweet from one of the developers from Obsidian about a ladder bug. I think it's in like I forget the name of the ship that the players have, but like if you do something on the ladder, you can essentially just keep going up and up and up and up. And had QA tried to regress this bug, retest. Sorry, that's a proper phrasing, to retest the bug. Even trying to do it, and they just couldn't figure it out. But then a player figured it out and gave them the replay. It's like, oh, we've been trying to do this for months. Like it's it can be difficult to try to recreate that bug. And like as long as you've tried like enough times to be like, okay, it might have just been a one-off. But then the players will find it and be like, damn it.
Again, this is the thing that's hard to explain. Sometimes because most games contracts say that we will guarantee or we will do our best efforts to make sure that the game is bug free. There's no game on the planet that's bug free. I think
No.
I think it's nearly impossible. But it all depends on your definition of bug. Is it a combination of device, aspect ratio, player interface, player behavior, coding experience? There's so many areas where something can go wrong. Like I say, missing textures. I mean, presumably that's the most frequent thing you're encountering. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, I think like missing textures, like missing objects. Usually they're caught like really early on.
Yeah.
So like it's like players never get to see them. But like when we're doing like new updates, things can kind of like accidentally be removed or things get changes. Like they start referencing things properly, so it's like, oh, okay, hey, this thing's missing, and it gets fixed like very quick. The players will never kind of notice because it's been fixed like 2 months ago or something.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's this different juxtaposition. So if it's not a missing texture, it may be the actual asset, and presumably the asset itself should be QA'd pretty quickly. But then it's some combination with the asset and the environment, or the environment itself as an asset. Some settings, some performance issue. What's the so you talked a little bit about troubleshooting. You find an issue, now you've got to troubleshoot it. How much of the troubleshooting do you do versus what the coder has to then do?
Well, if I'm the one that found it, then usually it's kind of my responsibility to kind of try to pinpoint it. Like I usually kind of inform because I'm embedded, I can just kind of go directly to developers and just say like, hey, this is an issue. So we'll see something and we'll call it out.
Yeah.
And so they might do a little bit of investigation themselves, or they might say, oh, hey, can you get this extra information?
Yeah.
But yeah, as soon as I see it, like and you start thinking, okay, what can I do to make this issue happen again, and maybe even try at different locations or different areas around the game, because it might just affect that one area, or it could affect like multiple different areas.
Again, just to sort of expand the thought about QA, I think we've talked a lot about kind of the environmental art aspect of it and the kind of differences that a lot of the QA teams that we work with, particularly, I want to make sure there's a script, there's a sort of flow, just to make sure that everything that we need to be covered in the experience. Now, those scripts change greatly with the objective of that QA process. So if we're checking art integrity, that's one thing. If we're checking user experience, that's a completely different way of approaching that testing. If we're looking at getting a end-to-end testing is different from unit testing. End-to-end being the whole game, and unit testing being this feature, that feature, the other feature. For example, in a particular module, we might be testing like tournament management. I don't necessarily have to have everything connected to do tournament management. I just need to make sure that what we call the stubs, in other words, the input outputs into that module, are providing the information that's expected. So I tend to write out use cases. So actor, the player, sees this, does this. This is what happens that they witness, and then this is what happens at the back end. By having that kind of like structural kind of approach, there's a terminology called UML, which is often used to describe that. But use cases, basically, having this approach of use cases allows me to say to a tester, this is what expected behavior is. Do you see it? Yes or no? What's the deviation from that? And then I know that if they've tested that repeatedly on each build, I know that the game is functioning as it should. I can regression tests against that in each update to the game. Does that sound familiar to you? Do you tend to use case models, or have you seen that kind of approach being used?
Yeah. So I think like some examples that, if I'm allowed to say, like we do have like I think like we do have like a huge database of like say test cases and stuff. So we kind of, and if a new feature or a new location comes out, like QA are pretty much top of it. They ask, okay, what can we expect? What features are there? So, like say shops, items to purchase, missions, and then they'll start creating test cases for those. So using like say locations as an example, because that's the one I kind of mainly work on, it would be a case of, okay, I need to create test cases for is the transit system working? It's like, are you able to use the elevators, use like say the shuttlecrafts to get around the different parts of like a landing zone? The art side of it, obviously, so like collisions, etc. Are NPCs walking through? So you're writing down like what's intended, what is supposed to happen. Like you can like that's like the kind of a surface level stuff, but then like when you start getting into more intricate parts of it, it could be like say with the shopping, it's like, okay, here's the whole list of everything that this place is selling. Is it selling correctly? Has it got the right descriptions? Has it got the right previews? Like it. When you start like delving into it like more and more, it can get quite complex and quite diverse with the user test cases. I mean, because like a lot of times we kind of do it like like feature by feature. I mean, like we have like different teams, different embedded testers, so they'll kind of focus on like what they do. So like if we have like say mission testers, they'll focus on like the functionality of the missions. I might help them out a little bit, but I probably will look at it more like from an art side of it to make sure the location of that mission is up to scratch.
So I think what the picture you're painting is that there is a skill, there is a process, there are tools. It's a complicated beast doing QA properly. Does that make it daunting for teams?
I mean, for me, it is quite an interesting challenge, I think is the best word to use, because it's the most important thing is just trying to keep on top of everything that's going on, because the nature of game development, like things kind of change, things evolve, things might get scrapped or whatever it could be. So it's just a case of making sure like all the information that you have is correct. You're working with like the most up-to-date knowledge about a location, about a mission, about the intended design functionality, and make sure that you're creating test cases based off those. And that's usually for companies, it could be like that could be on the responsibility of like say manager, but not managers. It'd probably be more like sort of like leads or seniors that would be kind of actively discussing with developers or their respective producers to be like, hey, can you give us as much information as possible? Is there like say a Wikipedia page or like a Confluence page or whatever it might be to give us the information we need to create test plans or test cases, whatever it may be.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a complicated piece, but you're right. It's a challenge but it's something we have to do because it's part of the development process. And actually, I think what we're talking about really is, if we didn't do it, the coders would have to do it, or the artists would have to do it. And you need a separate voice. You need a secondary perspective, I think, to be able to find the things that otherwise you would just naturally flow through.
Yeah,
I think that alternate view is a key part of what QA is, isn't it?
absolutely. It's like someone peer reviewing like your essay or something. Like you said, you need that second piece of light. I see sometimes like people like do hot takes on Twitter. Like people say, "Oh, why doesn't the coder just like test their own code?" It's like, well, they know how it works. They'll play it the way
Works on
it's.
my machine.
Oh God, no! Don't say no. Oh. I just
Sorry,
get
if you
PTSD.
don't know, the phrase "works on my machine" is banned in a lot of game studios' offices, and is still the most common thing said.
Oh God.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
It's absolutely fine.
You have to have been there to in a QA team to understand the pain of that phrase.
It's such an amazing phrase. I didn't expect me to react that way, but it was just like
It's deep-seated trauma, I think.
But yeah, like people like some people on Twitter might be like hot take would be like, okay, why does the designers or the artists whatever like test their own stuff? And like, yeah, they will do like an initial test, but like they know how it's supposed to play. They will play it the way that they intended it. Whereas like if I'm going into it fresh faced, not knowing how it's going to work, I'm going to play it the way that I think it should be played. And that's the great thing about games. Obviously, you can play it the way that you want. It's a very active experience. So you end up finding exploits and finding things that weren't intended. Especially when you're QA, you're actively trying to ruin someone's day. You're actively trying to break it and think like, what if I do X? What if I do Y? And trying to find ways to break things and give them like the bugs or even feedback sometimes, because like even with like you said, like with QA, because some people might think like, oh, it's just giving feedback to developers. It's mainly kind of obviously giving them bugs and like issues, but there are times where they might ask for feedback and be like, hey, what do you think of this location? What do you think of this mission, or whatever it might be? And you can give them quality feedback to be like, okay, I think this works, I think this doesn't work, you could improve it by doing X, Y, or Z, and then they can kind of use that data to be like, oh, okay, maybe we can make tweaks here and there to make it a better experience.
Yeah, completely. And like I say, there's a. Actually, I'm gonna take this full circle back to your kind of FE background and your teaching, and also your learning as a, because I'm too old for there to have been game dev courses back in my day. But do you think people prepare developers or potential developers strongly enough around the strengths and skill sets required to do good QA? Is that something you think is being taught?
I think sadly not really, because I don't know if I mentioned it in this in this section of the don't know what that I don't know if I mentioned it, but like I've been writing like a book on like getting into industry through QA, and one of the people that I have interviewed is a woman named Janelle, who's like a QA director at EA Vancouver, I believe, and she's also a teacher. Like she teaches like HE. I don't know what it's called like in the American side, but she does like
Community
a QA course. She teaches like a QA module because she believes that like you need to kind of, to be like a good designer, to be a good like whatever it might be in like in the games industry, you need to have like a good solid understanding of QA and how to find issues, how to report them correctly, and that might help you to fix them as well. And not enough courses kind of teach that, so it's mainly just kind of focusing on the discipline. So if you're doing like a games art course, obviously like QA might not be a thing you might need to learn, but if you're a programmer or a designer, I think it's absolutely worth understanding and knowing how to kind of structure, like say a test plan, so for you to run through your own game and then test things out, or how to look for bugs. It's not really like a module that's ever really taught. I think when I was teaching, we use like the 2010 BTEC curriculum, and there's a whole bunch of different units, and there was one that was specifically games testing, and I actually was like, oh, I want to teach a module on games testing, because I think it'll be because I know like a lot of students will probably have their first job, as you mentioned earlier, like being QA. So it was like this would be a great
if your first
starting
job's
point.
going to be QA, you should learn QA.
Yeah, absolutely. Like
give yourself a
I
fighting
think that
chance.
yeah, and that's the same thing that Janelle says as well. It's like, you know, that's going to most likely going to be your first job. So it's like you're going to have that you're going to have that experience like straight away. It's going to make you stand out. If you say in an interview, like, or even like say your cover letter, CV, like, I did a games testing module or course. It's like, oh, interesting. So you already kind of know it. You're going to have some of that base knowledge already.
Oh, exactly. So I think it's a massively undervalued part. I think, you know, the idea of a career in QA is not reinforced enough, although there have been a few voices trying to do that. So, you know, I'm not being entirely fair. But I think, you know, from my point of view as a designer at heart, who spent most of his career as a product owner, learning about what good is in QA, I think has been really important. That you know, that documentation, you know, reporting, whether you're using Jira, which I'm not huge. Well, actually, to be fair, when I was using Jira, I didn't enjoy it. I am told it's vastly better nowadays. So no offense intended to Jira lovers. We had to do Jira and Bugzilla at the same time because different reports to different teams.
That's weird. That's very strange. I don't know.
Painful. Yeah, I won't even get you started on that. But to me, it's not about the tool; it's about the attitude. You know, I want to ask for requirements that have use cases, because if I've got a requirement that's got a use case, I've already got a test script. If I've got a test script, then that can be tracked in a way that maps against the way I asked for the requirement of the coder or the artist in the first place. And I think that joined up thinking, you know, test driven development is an incredibly powerful way to work. You know, but it's rare because it's a bit arduous, it's a bit heavy lifted to get started, but I think it saves time and effort in the long run. I mean, have you seen any kind of preferred ways for yourself?
I can't think any off the top of my head.
Sorry.
I think like I do find it interesting, like learning. I've not done much like sort of automated testing. Like it's something that
Yes.
I've talked to a few people about, and that's a whole discipline in itself. Because like for me, it's kind of all like manual testing. So it's mostly just like me creating my own kind of like test cases and then running them in client. But I have kind of spoken to people to learn more about like, oh, you know, I've created this script to actually test things automatically, which I know it says like a huge amount of time, but you still need someone to kind of go in and kind of verify like, oh, this is like actually like a valid error report. Because sometimes one or two might just be like a false positive sometimes.
No, it could be, but I mean, automated testing is, like you say, a massively interesting area, particularly as we're doing more and more machine learning, and it's especially important when you're dealing with games that require scale. You know, if you've got a critical mass requiring game, you know, a first-person shooter or a mobile or something similar, it matters that you can see what happens when you have thousands of people playing simultaneously. You don't have thousands of testers. If you can't get automation, you haven't got it.
Yeah, I remember reading. Some people might be, I don't know if they're young enough to remember this, but like when GTA 5 first came out with its online mode, like it just immediately crashed. Like no one could play that game because so many people were trying to get into it. Like, oh, our servers cannot handle this. And so obviously their internal QA would have like tested the hell out of it for a long period of time, but like that'd only be like 30 or 40 people. Like how do you kind of
I don't know any different. I don't know that they didn't. But I think maybe because I've been doing online games for 24 years or whatever, actually getting more than that now. I don't even know how long I've been doing it. Far too long. My point being though is, ever since 98, we've had a regular repeating pattern where people push a game live without having had their test environment stress test first.
Yeah.
And when that happens, the game falls over and everyone goes, woe is me. And then 3 weeks, 6 weeks later, it's working and it's all fine and dandy. But they've lost that massive opportunity of the first moment of experience.
Yeah.
And, like you say, GTA Online had a problem like that. We've had so many different examples. Now, it's noticeable we've had fewer of them recently. And that's because we're being smarter at using cloud computing to work out how scaling. It's because we're using these automated testing rigs so we can run simultaneous multiple users in a scale that you couldn't afford to have as a team. And we're running more and more betas with those automated rigs running at the same time. So we get real players feeding back when the servers are being stressed.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, like I think like with like Star Citizen, like we have like the PTU, like the testing area for like say specific backers to kind of go into, so like they really help us like sort of stress test the environment as you mentioned, because like if your QA department is only like 50 people and this game's going to be played by a potentially 1,000, like there's no way you can physically do that. So like like the betas really help doing headless client testing, like I say with automated stuff. I think there's actually like QA companies that provide that as a service to like, hey, we can just like flood your servers full of these like AI bots or whatever it is to just to kind of stress test it as much as possible.
So you used the phrase headless client. Now, I know some people might not understand what that means. Do you want to quickly describe that, what that means?
From my knowledge, like I don't do like a lot of network testing, I believe, and you can correct me, it's essentially like automated testing. So it's just like essentially like almost like an AI that kind of just loads into the environment. So it's kind of simulating like multiple people coming into environment.
It's simulating the data connections without having to have a client running at the same time, basically.
Yeah.
So and again, I'm sure there are other definitions. I'm sure somebody will correct us on that. And obviously, I think we've been trying to do is do a roller coaster ride through the world of QA. I think what we've illustrated is just how complicated that beast is and how specialized it's become, because we're having to do with audio testing, art testing, technical testing, gameplay testing, multiplayer testing, automated testing. We're very reliant on tools. We need to make sure we've got proofing of assets. We need to make sure that the content management systems are functioning. The back end testing. How do you check that your staging, your live, your QA and your dev environments all operating correctly? I mean, that's a whole podcast in itself talking about back end services. But we don't have time for that today, sadly. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of things I think go into this space, and I think the more we think about how we can capture, I think you put it quite nicely, it's like a peer review. How we can facilitate the rest of the team to be able to do their job as efficiently as possible, because they can rely on an efficient peer review, which is going to provide them with documentation and fast tracks to get to the point where the problems are. And I think that's powerful. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to kind of like you've worded it so beautifully. I'm like, yes.
That's very kind. So you mentioned that you're writing a book on QA. Do you have any kind of timeframes for when that might come out?
I'm hoping it will come out this year. I'm still working on the manuscript. Thankfully, it's not like a huge book. It's meant to be like a handbook. It's like 100, it's gonna be like 100 pages long. It's essentially going to help people find their first job in QA. So the way that I've kind of framed it is like I'm writing about, hey, this is what QA is. This is what the different jobs are. Telling people like maybe telling like about education. It's like where to learn about game development, because I think it's really important to understand a little bit of the pipeline. So I think like making your own games is a great way. It's like, oh, I can understand like how things are kind of put together. Giving advice on creating cover letters, interviews, and then getting into like the day-to-day job as well. So it's a nice mix of stuff. Like I've tried to find that nice balance between some like normal advice that anyone can use, no matter what kind of industry or discipline in games that you want to do. and then going into more specific sort of QA stuff. So I kind of go in depth with how to create a bug report, so explaining like what you should and shouldn't do, and like different types of testing. And it's meant to be like a gateway, so it's quite easy to read, I hope, when it's finished. So it's like if someone doesn't fully understand like different types of testing, it's like, oh, okay, here's an example of like what it is and like what people might do.
Sounds fantastic. Hopefully you'll share that with us on the Discord group when that comes out. Will you be self-publishing, or have you got a publisher for that already?
This is actually being published. It's actually quite funny because like it's a CPD publishing. So
Okay.
they've done like a bunch of different sort of game dev related books. Some that I can't think off the top of my head. I have read them. But yeah, I think one of the people that work there reached out to me on Twitter and goes to me, "Hey, do you want to write a book about getting into industry through QA?" And I'm kind of like, sure, why not?
Why not?
It sounded interesting. So it's I like to push myself with new challenges. So it's kind of like, ooh, this could be something fun. Like I love like helping people. It's why I got into teaching
You'd never
originally.
find me writing a book. Sorry, but the point I suppose is, hopefully you'll share with us when that's available. It sounds like a great thing to do. I'm really looking forward to seeing what it looks like and having a read myself. Harún, thank you so much for spending time with me. If somebody wants to get hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Best place would be Twitter. I mean, who knows how long that's going to survive for now, but you can find me at RetroAli93. That's the best way. And my DMs are open, so if anyone ever needs like any sort of advice on QA, feel free to contact me. I'm always happy to help people.
Well, thanks, Harún. That's been great. I really appreciate you taking the time out for us. So this has been your Game Dev London podcast. I've been your host, Oscar Clark. We've had the fantastic Harún joining us to talk to us about QA and particularly his work that he's doing on the intriguing Star Citizen. Whatever happens to the game, we will find out. I'm making no judgment calls. But remember, this is a community for people who love making games. We want to find out what you think. What's important to you about the QA process? What's important about the idea of making games? What role does that play? Are we educating people sufficiently to understand what's needed to ensure that games as they're developed are done so as effectively, as efficiently as possible? So at the end of the day, players get great experiences that really work for them. Let us know what you think. We have a Discord. Come and join us. Come and talk to us. If you've got other questions, if you think podcasts like this are useful, if you've got ideas for new topics, then please come and talk to us. And you can find me at Athanasius. Yes, I know it's terrible to spell. Look it up in the notes. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Mastodon. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on everything as well. So, and don't forget to check out Game Dev London podcast. Thank you very much.